Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today. My name is Pastor Michelle, coming at you from the Gathering Place International Ministries. Welcome to this section of this testimony that we're going to have live with Pastor Miriam Rodriguez. She has been my friend for over 30 years. We practically grew up together, from young women, young mothers, single mothers, everything else that you want to put in there, to women of God, women of purpose, women of destiny, because that's what God does. So I want to introduce to you my very best friend in the whole wide world, my sister from another mother, Pastor Miriam Rodriguez. Thank you for being with us.
Amen. Thank you for having me.
It's an honor and a privilege to have you. You know, we've been through thick and thin. I can testify to this testimony. I was part of her life. And so we're going to speak today a little bit, and we're going to have probably a 10 or 12 minute testimony, and then we're going to have a second part. So stay tuned for the second part. Pastor Miriam, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood?
Well, I am of parents, Puerto Rican parent descent. They moved here to the mainland from Puerto Rico before I was born. They moved to Dover, New Jersey, where I was born. I am the youngest of 6 children, and I was raised in Newark, New Jersey. My father moved to Newark, New Jersey, where he began to commute to work to Morristown and had 2 jobs. And as a youngest of 6 children, I was left alone a lot. Mm-hmm. And so as my parents both worked and just seeking to better a better life for every one of us, I went through Catholic school all my life, from kindergarten through 8th grade, interrupted 3rd and 4th, where I did 3rd and 4th grade in Puerto Rico. Went to Catholic school, and that's all I really knew was the Catholic faith. And but being left alone a lot did something to me as I look back now and realize that I became a loner.
So let's stop right there. Being left alone physically, or being left alone emotionally? Because I know, as the youngest child, sometimes we don't know where we belong, and so we're left alone emotionally. So, or both.
Well, being left alone emotionally and physically would be the what I would think happened to me. When I look back now, my mother was working. My mother had no time. Daddy had no time. And when Mom came from work, she was gone all day, and then she came from work, it was to take care of my father, cook, and get ready for the next day. So as a child, I wasn't understanding that a lot. And so being left alone emotionally, in my mind, was I wasn't loved. I wasn't being cared for. I didn't get the attention that I needed, that I, as a child, need.
This is a very important point that you make, because there's times when parents have to make these sacrifices. We know that our children are not born with a book, but every child is different. And so what may affect one child will not affect the other child. But nonetheless, being left alone affected you, and it took you to make very bad choices in life just out of this simplicity, that what some parents may think is simple. I gotta work, you gotta stay by yourself. But we are looking at a point here that is so important. If you have a child that is exhibiting or showing signs of being a loner, or signs of being always doing their own thing, and not talking and not speaking and not, outwardly expressing, probably is what I want to get at. It's very important that you pay attention to that as a parent. Continue.
So looking back now, being left alone a lot just gave me a sense of being curious. I began to connect with people, places, and things, the wrong people, the wrong places. Became a rebellious child, very disobedient, and just began to get into trouble by the age of 12 years old. And 13, I was already smoking marijuana, I was drinking, I was using acid at the time, and just being a disobedient child.
So you were also fearless.
I became very fearless to the point where if my parents were sleeping, I'd sneak out the window during the wee hours of the night and be back before they woke up in the morning and things like that as a child. I mean, I look at my grandchildren now and I can't imagine any of my granddaughters doing something like that, you know, but that's what happens when you're unattended.
Especially in a city like Newark. We're not talking about a small town. We're talking about a big city where, right, especially in the years where we were raised, the crime rates were so high. So continue. So now you're 13, you're 12, you're doing drugs, you're unattended, you're still unattended, you're feeling alone. What was the feeling that you had inside at this point? You know, I know it was, you were fearless and I know you felt lonely. Do you think that you was depressed?
I think that I don't know that I was depressed. I would say that I was very sad and began to look for love in all the wrong places, being accepted by boys that were no good for me, just seeking that attention that I so desired to have, and that went on throughout the years. And so I remember having a boyfriend at the age of 14 who was very abusive, and my parents, after a beating from this boy, sent me to Puerto Rico, where I was to stay with my grandmother. And my grandmother was Catholic as well, and when I came back home to live with my parents, she sent me with this big altar and a lot of statues and candles, and I was to light it every night. But I remember being afraid because the candle would do all these images on the ceiling and on the walls, and I would be afraid at night, and so I would turn off the candles. But in the transcourse of that time, I met some Muslim people, and I got connected with them. I was passing down 7th Avenue in Newark, New Jersey, where they had a store, and they were closing the store because they were doing the afternoon prayer. And so I asked them if I could watch, and when I did, I noticed that there were no idols, that there were no statues, that there was nothing like that in there. And so I began to visit them. I began to visit the mosque and converted into the religion of Islam. And after a year, that's where I met my son's father.
So stop right there. So now you have converted to Islam. Tell me a little bit about what you learned as a young girl. You were now 16?
I was, yes, when I married him, I was 16.
Oh, okay. So you were 15 when you entered into this phase of your life.
Right.
And tell me, as a young girl, what did you learn in the mosque?
Well, the one thing I did learn greater than anything is that there was no honor to the woman. Women were to be in one room, the men in another room. Men had 2 and 3 wives, and there was more drugs in that community than I had when I was outside. So my addiction got worse. Mm-hmm. After I got married, about a year and a half after I got pregnant, I had twins. And while my twins were about a year old, I got pregnant for my 3rd son. And while I was 5 months pregnant, that's when their father left.
So all of this happened within 2 years' time.
Yes.
You were now 18 or 19, maybe 3 years' time. You were 18 or 19 with 3 children. Where did you live? Who supported you? What happened there?
I was 19 years old with 3 boys, and I was living in a 4th floor building in Newark, no elevator, and it was a very, very hard time. My parents had went back to Puerto Rico to live. I had no family. The only friends I had were friends that were Muslim and that were into drugs, and so it was like I couldn't go forward. I couldn't move forward. I was still stuck in being alone, being rejected, being abandoned, being betrayed, being looked upon now, because back in the day when there was a woman alone with children, there was a certain frown that people would put on you, like you made this great big mistake, so now you're worth nothing.
So how did you survive financially? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, financially, I did a lot of stealing. I stole a lot of my kids' clothes, food. I would go to the supermarkets, and as I was in the Islamic garb, I would steal, and just to survive. And it wasn't even about an addiction, because during that time, I wasn't an addict. Yes, I smoked marijuana, and once in a while did that, but it wasn't an addiction. It wasn't stealing to support a habit. It was more to support my family.
It wasn't life controlling. You did drugs, but they weren't life controlling.
They were not
as
life
of
control-
yet.
As of yet.
So, who paid the rent for you during that?
Well, I was on public assistance, and then I began to sell marijuana, and I began to sell this other drug back then that was very high at that time, and the drug money would come in for me to sell these drugs and to just pay my bills and to support my family at that time.
How was your personal life? Were you still going to the mosque? What were you teaching your children?
I was going to the mosque. I was visiting, not as frequent. I couldn't move much with 3 babies. And I taught my children the foundation of Islam. That was the beginning of their life. They were born into the foundation of the religion of Islam and Islamic beliefs.
So we're going to leave it right here. Pastor Miriam is going to say a few words to end this video. But I want you young ladies and young men who have the opportunity to make choices to hear the rest of what happened in her life, because this is only the beginning of bad choices, the beginning of consequences, and you need to hear. But then you're also going to hear how God came into her life and how there was a transformation and healing, and it's been a process, but she lives in victory. So go ahead, Pastor Miriam, say whatever God.
Well, the one thing that I do want to say is that I learned to love myself. I learned that I was beautiful. I learned that I didn't have to go to a man for acceptance or for him to be accepted. And I learned who I was and how much I was worth. And I learned that I can raise 3 boys because I made better choices later on. I went and got my GED, and then after that I went to school, and then I met Christ, and the story goes on to after I met Jesus Christ. But the greatest thing I learned is that I was alone with 3 children, but the loneliness that I felt at that time was taken away when I met Jesus Christ. And so I learned that I didn't need the acceptance and the love of a man to help me make it through the day. I didn't need drugs and alcohol to help me make it through the day. I didn't need to steal. I didn't need to do anything else to help me make it through the day, because now I had learned who was God, who was Christ in my life, but more importantly, who I am and who He created me to be.
So stay tuned. God bless you, and thank you very much.
Thank
you, Pastor Mary.
You're welcome.